Jimmy, I think we should start now.
Yep, sounds good.
Yeah, sounds good. Yeah. Okay, so hello everyone. On behalf of the entire EPSP Connects team and my co-host Jimmy Gullinger and I, Dev Singh, welcome you all to our monthly EPSP Connect Science Talk. So today, the speaker is Dr. Nathan Jones. He is currently a assistant professor at Department of Biological Sciences, University of Alabama, USA. He works on multi-scale systems, which range from small upland wetlands to large river systems. And he uses tools across different domains, such as engineering, environmental sciences, and the social science domains. And the title of today's talk is Incorporating Watershed Storage, Hydrological Connectivity, and the Natural Flow Regime into Water Resource Management. So we are going to hear his talk on water resource management, incorporating all these different type of tools. And on behalf of our team, we welcome Dr. Nathan Jones. So Nathan, you can start sharing your screen.
Okay, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. All right, well, I just wanted to thank Jimmy, Manu, and everyone else for inviting me. I'm really excited to give this talk. I'm at the Joint Aquatic Sciences meeting right now, so that's why I've got my screen blurred. But I'm really excited to be here and share some of my group's recent work with you. Go ahead and start my timer so I get you guys out of here on time. So today I'm going to give you guys a brief background of my overview, or a brief overview of my background, and then a brief intro to upstream processes and then how they cascade to downstream functions. And then we're going to talk through 3 case studies, thinking about headwater wetlands, non-perennial streams, and then large river floodplains. And then finally, hopefully we'll end with a start of a conceptual model that we can start to take some of this fundamental research that my group and collaborators have been doing and maybe actually start to make it actionable. So for folks in the room that are potentially students or postdocs, I come from a very interdisciplinary background, and I'd love to talk to you about that afterwards and some of the adventures and perhaps misadventures I've had. But I started out in biosystems engineering. I did a postdoc in a forestry department of Virginia Tech, and then I also I did a second postdoc at the National Socio-Environmental Synthesis Center, where I got to work with social scientists quite a bit. It's been just a great decade of work and learning. And for folks who are also moving in this interdisciplinary space, I'd encourage you to keep working through it, because the payoff is really great. I'm now at the University of Alabama. I joined the biology department here. I'm starting my 4th year now, and I work in the Center for Freshwater Studies, and most of my work is with aquatic ecologists now, which has been also a ton of fun. And so just to jump into the upstream processes and downstream function. Water resources management, I realize I'm kind of preaching to the choir here, but water resources management is really, it continues to be one of the one of these global large scale challenges we're working on it as a community. Everything from water distribution and getting people clean drinking water. Even here in the US, delivering clean drinking water to especially our rural communities is still a challenge. Water is absolutely important for energy production and agriculture. My background is actually in bio and ag engineering, and so water absolutely plays a huge role in our agricultural production and food systems. And finally, what I spend most of my time thinking about is how water interacts with ecosystems, and in particular aquatic ecosystems. Hydrologic variation is a big part of what structures these systems and the resulting function. And in particular, I've spent a lot of time thinking about downstream water bodies, or how what we do up in the watershed impacts these downstream water bodies. I did my graduate school and both of my postdocs in the Chesapeake Bay, so that's here on the left in the Virginia, Maryland area. And then now that I live in Alabama, we're also thinking about the Mobile Bay in Mobile, Alabama, that it's right there in the Gulf of Mexico, so that's here on the right. And so, these are really special places. They're hotspots for biodiversity. And they really, the health of these water bodies really tells us they're kind of a canary for what's happening upstream in the watershed. And so I wanted to introduce a few concepts before diving too deep. And the first is the natural flow regime. This comes out of Leroy Poff's work, and I think this was published in 1997. So, we're talking about over 20 years ago. But the point here is that we're thinking about how the magnitude, frequency, duration, timing, and rate of change impact ecosystem functions. And I always like to describe this kind of like the band. I'm a big fan of the White Stripes and their bass lines, but their songs, they wouldn't. The bass line is my favorite part, but honestly, the song wouldn't be the song without the rest of the band. And so when we think about flow regimes and flow variation, oftentimes folks will focus on one particular flow metric. As an engineer, I was always taught to think about high flows, and also more and more we've been thinking about low flows, thinking about drought. But when we're taking a systems approach, I think, or the argument here is that we should be looking at all the different types of variation and how that impacts function. And so this flow regime approach, at least in my viewpoint, has really been the result of that from a management standpoint is e-flow science or environmental flows. So how do we manage outflows of our dams in a way that's responsible for both upstream water users and downstream ecosystems? And just as an example, that was the Glen Canyon Dam, the picture in the previous slide. This is a hydrograph before the Glen Canyon Dam was put in the 1960s. You can see that the flow regime, has greatly changed. And there's been so much good, rich work on that change in flow regime and how that's impacted downstream ecosystems. This is a recent work, and I just cherry picked this, but looking at how hydropeaking impacts macroinvertebrates, and in particular how those changes cascaded through the rest of the food web. But what I'm really excited about thinking about is, we've done this really good work and thought, we're moving forward and thinking of ways to better manage our dam systems. But when we talk about the flow regime, it's actually, a spatially distributed process. And so are there ways that we can manage our land use and our watersheds in such a way where we can also either restore or maintain appropriate flow regimes? So thinking through that, diving deep back into the hydrologic literature, Hewlett and Hibbert's the kind of seminal work in 1965, where they presented the variable source area concept, which is for a lot of us in hydrology is really the basis for our understanding of how catchments function. In that same paper, they also talked about this hierarchical controls on rainfall runoff and the associated hydrologic variation. And so really this is we've kind of been revisiting this with multiple collaborators, but thinking about the very top drivers, your climatic conditions, the balance of precipitation and evapotranspiration, and then moving down from there, thinking about physiographic drivers. So I live in Alabama, and we have not only do we have amazing freshwater diversity, but we also have quite a bit of diversity in our physiography. We go from Appalachian Plateau to the Piedmont, to upper coastal plain, and then to the lower coastal plain. And each one of those physiographic regions has very different hydrology, even though the climate is relatively the same over this gradient. The geology is wildly different. And then finally, thinking, driving in a little bit more when we think at the local scale, the storage and connectivity, and I'll get more into that as we go, but like how are our watersheds plumbed? What does the subsurface architecture look like, and how is that affecting the variation in stream flow? And then obviously the how does that variation in stream flow and changes to that variation impact ecosystem function? And so when I talk about watershed storage and connectivity, at the simplest form, we're just talking about, well, where does water, where is it stored on the landscape or in the landscape? And then how does it move between those storage volumes? And so I kind of, I divide the world up into to bioreactors, so the picture on the right, and then pipes connecting those bioreactors is kind of how I conceptualize the world. Obviously, that simplification is an oversimplification, but sometimes helps us think about these storage volumes and how they change over time and the connectivity between them. So the fundamental questions that I want to get at here today are, can we develop predictive relationships between the drivers of hydrologic variability and downstream function? And how can we use that information to better manage our ecosystems? And so to jump into these case studies, I'm going to first talk about Headwater wetlands and work I've been doing since my postdocs, starting back in 2014. And science is a team sport. We're taught to talk about, my program and the work my team is doing. But in reality, this work could not have been done without a large group of people. The picture at the top is a working group at the USGS Powell Center, consisting of folks from USGS and EPA. And I was lucky enough to be a postdoc and part of that group. The group on the left is Margaret Palmer's lab at the University of Maryland. And I worked with them for several years. And then kind of an outfall of that is the Delmarva Disco group, the bottom right. And we have NSF funding to continue kind of this large body of work that all these people have been working on. And so as I go, I'll try to give credit where credit is due, but just know that this is not just my work, it's our larger group's effort. Okay, so why do we care about hydrologic variability in wetlands? And again, similar to the previous slides, I know I'm preaching to the choir, but here in the Southeast, ducks are really, they're both a big cultural component, duck hunting, but it's also a huge economic driver in the Southeast. For folks who are biologists in the room, we also, wetlands have incredible biodiversity resources. So there's, these places, especially like in South Alabama, this is reticulated flatwood salamander. And we're the only place that they can live is a specific type of wetland. Wetlands, what I spend a lot of time thinking about is their incredible hotspots for nutrient removal. In some cases, you might say there's been multiple studies that show they're the most efficient way to remove nitrogen in agricultural landscapes. And then finally, wetlands are really important for carbon by geochemical cycling. And honestly, we're still working to understand how they affect carbon storage and different carbon fluxes. The big problem here, though, is we've lost a lot of our wetlands. And so this is a map of wetland loss across the US from Irina Creed. And so in Alabama, we've estimated that we've lost about 50% of our wetlands, but places like California and Illinois and in places in the Midwest, we've lost up to 90% of our wetlands. So not only have we lost these wetlands on an aerial basis, but we've also lost their functions. And so understanding what drives these functions hopefully will help us better restore these wetlands, but also potentially help us protect the wetlands or be targeted about the wetlands that we protect that we have left. So jumping back to this hierarchical model I started out with, what I'm going to do, and I'll do this for all the case studies, is I'm going to step through the larger climatic drivers and the physiographic drivers, and then move down to more of a local scale to look at storage and connectivity and how it cascades the ecosystem function. So to start, we did, as part of the Powell Center, we worked on a national scale effort to look at drivers of wetland hydrology. And specifically to do this, we used the wetland hydrologic capacitance model. This is a model that Daniel McLaughlin and I put together. I don't want to dive too deep into the details, but essentially it's just a bucket model where we're moving water between a lumped upland module that simulates storage and fluxes and a small headwater catchment. And then we also have an individual wetland module that we also we're using as well to track water level variations in an individual wetland. And the important part here is that we're measuring lateral groundwater fluxes, which is a kind of a unique component to this model. And so we applied this model to 3 archetypal landscapes: the prairie pothole region in the northern Midwest, Delmarva Bay wetlands on the east coast of the US, and then finally cypress domes in southern Florida. And so, as you can expect, all these places have very different climatic drivers and also very different geologies. And so to do this, I snagged one Huck 8 from each of the regions. And then we used several publicly available data sets to parameterize the model. And we ran the model, we developed climate simulations, and we ran the model for 1,000 years. So I'm going to show you the results of this. And these plots on the y-axis here, this is water level. So it's this normalized water level. And then the x-axis is Julian day. And the important point here is that I'm showing you the average hydrograph across 1,000 years. So we're compressing a lot of variation into a single line. So this line is an example of one you might see, and this is representing one wetland. And we're simulating anywhere from 500 to 1,500 wetlands. So it kind of looks like a spaghetti graph, but the point here is it gives us an indication of what the seasonality of these wetlands look like under current climate conditions. And so in the prairie pothole region, we see that there's an increase in water level in the spring, and that lines up. There's a spring freshetta when there's snow melt, and that's when a lot of the hydrologic connectivity occurs in the prairie pothole region. When we move to the Delmarva wetlands, we see a drawdown occurring in the late summer and fall, which is absolutely what we see there as well. In fact, I'm not presenting this here, but we did some empirical data to show how the timing of ET and leaf on and leaf off really drive the hydrology of these systems. And then finally, thinking about South Florida, you also have a drawdown, but it occurs much earlier. And I can attest to this because I've moved further south recently. It gets hotter much earlier. And so you have ET kicking in, causing that drawdown in water level much earlier in these wetlands. So we wanted to do a sensitivity analysis to look at what's driving some of these fluxes. And so here we're looking at the x-axis is sensitivity, and then the y-axis is sensitivity, and the x-axis are the different input parameters into the model. And when we think about surface water fluxes, which are often important for regulatory agencies and how we classify these wetlands is whether they're federally protected or not, we wanted to see, at least in modeling space, what parameters are really driving those fluxes. And what we found is that KSATs, or saturated conductivity in the upland, also watershed area are really sensitive parameters for the surface water flux. When we looked at groundwater fluxes out of these headwater catchments, because we think, in a lot of these areas that are dominated by wetlands, we know that shallow subsurface fluxes of groundwater are quite important. We found there that overwhelmingly the depth to confining layer was an important driver of those fluxes. I do want to highlight, again, this is all in modeling space, which is, at best, it's an informed hypothesis, but later on, I'll show some results that also highlight that this kind of bears out, at least in one location with our empirical data. And finally, we're looking at lateral fluxes, so water moving from the wetland to the upland and vice versa. And in our modeling space, there was no one parameter that popped out as most sensitive, which is somewhat to be expected because these fluxes, that while they're very important, they are quite variable. And so thinking, since we were thinking about these large climatic drivers and then also the large scale physiographic drivers that drive variation in wetlands, we were able to actually dig into one site on the Delmarva Peninsula, and we instrumented six catchments to really drive into the local scale and what's driving local storage and connectivity in this particular landscape. And so each catchment, we instrumented several wetlands. We had a primary wetland where we had a surface water stilling well, and then 3 upland groundwater wells. And in these, and we also are doing a ton of biogeochemical estimates, and I'm not going to talk about those as much today, but we just instrumented the heck out of these catchments. And the important part here is these wetlands. This is a picture of one. They're both small, so less than 2 hectares, and they go dry regularly. So this is a picture of one of those wetlands when they went dry. And to give you an idea of the hydrology, this is a wetland hydrograph from the 2018 water year. And what you see is that we kind of have a re-wetting period early in the water year, a wet period that starts in winter and runs through early summer. And then after that, we have a drawdown. In this particular year, we had a hurricane come through, so we had a couple of re-wetting events, but generally, we had this annual cycle holds across the region, and it's driven by this official groundwater table. And so to jump into the things that we found that are driving the hydrology, specifically thinking about access to water. So how deep is that confining layer? And so when we look at looking at 3 years of data, when we look at the mean water level, we find that that's actually that correlates with elevation. So if I pop back to the previous slide, what we're thinking here is that the wetlands higher up in the hill slope, they have less access to the groundwater table, and so that's why they have shorter hydro periods. They're hydrated for shorter periods of time. We also see that wetland size is quite important, and so these 2 wetlands here, they're co-located and they're at the same elevation, but one is obviously much larger than the other, and they have different bathymetry, so different shapes in the bottom. And what you see is that the smaller wetland, so in this plot, water level is on the y-axis and time is on the x-axis. But what you see is the smaller wetland has much more variable water level, and the larger wetland is much more stable. When we look across all of our sites, we do see that water level variation, so that's on the y-axis here, it decreases with wetland area over time, and that's a fairly consistent theme. And finally, we see that watershed storage, or the amount of or the storage capacity of the wetlands, the amount of water it can hold, is another driver of variability. And so I don't have time to get into this, but we spent a lot of time trying to characterize this watershed storage. We modified Kuai-Sheng Wu's level set method, which accounts for the kind of hierarchical nested nature of these wetlands and the fill spill merging patterns that they have. What we found is that it was a fairly weak relationship, but we did see a relationship between recession rate and the storage capacity of those wetlands. And so finally, you might be asking, or a lot of groups, maybe not this group, well, great, that you have some correlations on what might be explaining the water level variation, but what does that mean for carbon processing? Because these small wetlands, we know they play an important role in regional carbon dynamics. And so we conducted several experiments across our wetland sites, looking at the gradient from the wetland edge up to the upland area. So that's what's shown here in the top figure. And we did this across 5 of our wetland sites through those primary wetlands. So the first thing that we looked at was the microbial communities, and specifically we're focused on methane here because again, these wetlands, they're hypothesized as being important sources of methane to the region, or maybe not important sources, but large contributors of methane to the region. And we see that as you move from the wetlands to the uplands, you decrease the abundance of methanogen communities, which is largely what we would expect. But when so Christine Mayetta did this work, but when she looked at what was structuring those communities, both the depth of water, the mean depth of water at each location, and also the saturated duration were, those popped out as correlating with community structure in the NNBS here. Kelly Hondula, who's a postdoc at ASU right now, she also looked at methane fluxes along this gradient, and she found there's a ton of variability. So this plot here is looking at water level when she took the measurement, and then on the x-axis, and then the methane flux on the y-axis, and what she found is really the only time that we saw significant methane fluxes is when the water level, when there was inundation, which actually was kind of surprising to us. We assumed that there would be methane fluxes from the saturated areas, but it was really only when there was inundation. And Kelly did a lot of really great work, and I don't have time to dig into it, but one of the things that she did is she did some remote sensing work to kind of try to look through the trees and see if we could measure the variation in water level at the watershed scale, and using high resolution remote sensing imagery from Planet. And there's a ton to dig into here in this particular figure, but what I really wanted to highlight is that, so on the x-axis is methane emissions, and on the y-axis is methane emissions, and on the x-axis is the wetland size. And our small wetlands, which are also more abundant, they produce an outsized amount of methane. And these are also the wetlands that we often don't think about in our global scale models or our regional scale models. And yeah, they play an outsized role in methane production. So you might be asking, okay, well, how? That's all good. We've connected, looked at potential variability or drivers of variability at the local scale, and how that affects function. But how do we use this in a management scheme? Well, on the Eastern Shore of Maryland, the way we do restoration is we actually, most wetlands were drained by installing ditches, and we literally just plug the ditch. And that's the first part of restoration. And for those of you who work in this area, there's obviously way more steps, and there's a ton of uncertainty. In fact, Margaret's group is working on a lot of that uncertainty. But that's how we change the inundation regime. And so that's at least, thinking about connecting the changes in inundation regime by plugging the ditch to these cascading functions is where we're at. And so we actually have 3 students at Virginia Tech currently working on this, Katie Wardensky, Carla Lopez, and Nick, and they're doing a ton of great work, and I don't want to steal their thunder, but Katie actually just sent off her first paper for publication, and Carla and Nick aren't too far behind. So yeah, definitely look for what their work coming out. And if you're on Twitter, we use the Delmarva Disco tag. Okay, so moving on to non-perennial streams or streams that go dry. This work has largely been done with the Dry Rivers RCN network. And then really more recently, the Ames team, which is we wrote the Ames grant while we were at the Dry Rivers, or at a Dry Rivers meeting, or at least we started writing it there. So both of these are very large interdisciplinary teams, and this work is absolutely because of their efforts. And so something that was shocking to me, and something I didn't realize, is that the majority of our stream miles go dry. And which is crazy, even in a place like Alabama, where we get over 56 inches of rain a year, over half of our streams go dry. And the majority of our work is in perennial rivers and streams. So even though there's most of our stream network goes dry, we don't actually understand how these systems function, and really, and what's important here is how that functioning impacts downstream waters. But we do know, there's starting to be a ton more studies on this here at JASM this week. There's been multiple special sessions on this, and we know that at a local scale, this stream drying absolutely does have an impact on both the ecology of the system and also the biogeochemistry, so the downstream fluxes of solutes. And again, these are largely understudied. This is a Corey Krabenhoff. Actually, this paper was just published last week, but we looked at the biases and gauges across the globally, and there's definitely locations where we have an abundance of these non-perennial streams, and there's hardly any gauges on these systems. And so again, the fundamental questions my team has been asking is, can we develop predictive relationships between hydrologic variability and downstream function? And then how do we use that to better manage our ecosystems? So when we think about climatic drivers, this is work that Adam Price did. looking at, the variability and drying across the USGS gauge network. And so we had, I think it was 540 gauges, something around there, where we looked at stream drying. And what you can see in these plots, these are for each of the different physiographic regions. The black area here is the fraction of gauges where there was no flow. And so you can see some really obvious regional trends. For example, in the Mediterranean climate, or in Mediterranean climates, you obviously have this period from spring to winter where you have this large period of dry down. Whereas in the eastern forest, which is the region I live in, you have dry down at the end of the water year, but mostly most of our gauges don't go dry very often. So John Hammond took this work and he looked at regional differences in drivers at the annual scale of non-perennial streams, and specifically he was looking at the annual no flow fraction, the first date of no flow, and then the period from the peak of an event to no flow. And what he found, we definitely in this paper saw variation across space. And really interesting, using that same data set, Sam Zipper at KU looked at if we're seeing changes over time. And so Sam actually found that as you move south, so in northern part of the US, we're actually, it seems that our streams are getting wetter, at least these three no flow metrics, these three low flow metrics by those standards, you're getting wetter. But as you move south, we're getting drier. And so we're going to have increased intermittence in the southern US. Adam took it a step further and started to think about drivers of subdaily or sub-annual or event scale drivers of what's driving the shape of these individual drying events. And it was really interesting at the annual scale. We were able to connect those metrics to and the changes really to large scale climatic and physiographic drivers. But when he looked at these event scale metrics, he really found that things like land use and things we derive from the DEM, those were the most important drivers of, or at least according to the random forest analysis, those were what were driving the variation between those data sets. And so, if you squint your eyes, this really points to the fact that, well, maybe it's how, this local scale storage and connectivity is what's driving the differences in these events. If we're moving down the hierarchy, those are definitely playing a role at the event scale. And so that brings us to the empirical work, where we want to look at the storage and connectivity of individual watersheds. And so on the Ames team, this is an enormous project. There's roughly 18 PIs. I think there's really like 11 main PIs, but 18 different PIs across 8 institutions. We have 9 instrumented watersheds where we're studying hydrology, biogeochemistry, biodiversity of macroinvertebrates, and also stream microbiome. So we're just collecting, it's an enormous amount of data. And the reason I bring this up is because we really want people to come use our data, because we're doing this in an open science framework. And so we're not only are we inviting collaborators, but that's one of our goals, is to produce a data set that the community can utilize. And so again, we have 9 watersheds spread across 3 regions in the Intermountain West, in the Southeast where I'm at, and then in the Midwest in Kansas and Oklahoma. In each of these sites, we have a ton of instrumentation out. At the outlet of the watershed, we have what we call the super sensors. So we're measuring everything from continuous nitrate and dissolved oxygen to conductivity, pH, and temperature. Throughout the watershed, we have 8 long-term monitoring stations where we do regular synoptic sampling. And then also at a higher spatial resolution, we have these stick sensors that are binary water level loggers that are telling us whether or not we have water at that particular location. And yeah, so just a ton of data, really high resolution data, to where we can really drive into what's what's driving the local storage and connectivity, and how does that impact these different ecosystem functions? Kind of looking at some initial results, my PhD student Delaney Peterson and a postdoc at Alabama, Corian Tattery, they're looking at how the vertical, horizontal, and longitudinal variation in hydrologic connectivity are impacting nitrogen processing at the Tanglewood Biological Station. And one of the things that's been really interesting is we found that the stream channel incision is quite important. So we have highly erodible soils here in the Southeast, and there's some really interesting patterns where we have areas of high slope where you have pretty major incision, like up to 3 meters, and we're talking about streams that are, flowing at liters per minute, and there's that much incision. It's really wild. And then we have, kind of a typical stream where you have normal bed and banks. And finally, there are these wetland areas where there's a slope break and there's just a ton of deposition, and you have, multi-channel streams and tons of wetlands. And it's a really exciting place to work. But we find that these 3 different hydrogeomorphic units is what we're calling them, definitely play a role in how water is moving through the watershed. And in particular, looking at the horizontal connectivity from the hill slope to the stream or vice versa. This plot, this is looking at the mean water level over the course of 1 year in our wells. And what you really see is that in the gully, the upland area is almost consistently a source of water to the stream. But in our wetland, that we see that the stream is actually providing a subsidy of water to the riparian area, which is a really exciting finding, and something that we're thinking about the implications of that for the riparian areas, and also what that means for incision as well in stream restoration. One thing that we did, we started to play with some geophysics, and this is very initial data, and I'm sure you guys will have a lot of thoughts on this, but we did see some variation across our wetland transect where we did the geophysics. So this is at the far left side is where the stream is, and then we're moving up that wetland transect, or the transect that leads to the wetland. And something that's really interesting is our current working hypothesis is we're actually this is ERT, where the variation, we think part of that may be due to the different sources of water. So the groundwater has a large iron content and large TDS. So we think that's driving some of the differences that we're seeing in the ERT. And specifically, this toe slope area, we think this might be indicative of upwelling, which is quite interesting because we see a lot of seep wetlands with a lot of iron content right there at that toe slope. So yeah, we're digging into that. I'd love to get y'all's thoughts on that later. And then finally, we're trying to start to think about residence time and how that's impacting denitrification rates. And that kind of gets us to how storage and connectivity cascades to function. Although this is all very much in process, and a lot of work left to do. Finally, I want to briefly talk about floodplains. This is where I started my career, and I'm really excited to get back to an area of the country where floodplains play an important role in both watershed management, but also ecosystems. So when we think about floods and floodplains, we often think about flood risk. And so this is a picture of the Old River control structure along the Mississippi that shunts water into the Atchafalaya Basin, and essentially this acts as flood protection for downstream areas, New Orleans and Baton Rouge. And so, I can't see the bottom of my slides. I'm sorry. We often think about flood risk, and my group is doing a little bit of this. We're specifically with Kelsey Piper at Northeastern. We're looking at how inundation impacts well water resources. And so I'm looking for a student on this, so a shameless plug. But what I really want to focus on today is the importance of floods, because they do structure our ecosystem, and particularly here in the Southeast, our bottomland hardwood forests, which are really important and special ecosystems. back to these fundamental questions. Can we develop predictive relationships between drivers of hydrologic variability and downstream function? And how can we use that to better manage our landscapes? So some work that I started during my PhD that Durrell Scott, my PhD advisor, finished was looking at flooding across the USGS gauge network. We had something like, I think it was 5,200 USGS gauges where we looked at, we used a breakpoint analysis to essentially look at the proportion of water that was moving from the stream into the floodplain. And similar to the dry down, we definitely see very distinct regional differences. For example, when we look at the Missouri River, we see that in the late spring, we see a pretty large increase in both river flow, which is the dotted line there, and then also the river floodplain connectivity, which is the orange ribbon here. So we see that roughly about 10% of stream flow is moving through the floodplains, at least at these gauges. But then when you shift and you look at someplace like the Southeast US, you don't see as much seasonality in that flooding because we often, our floodplains are often full of water. It's pretty common. And when using that same data set, we looked at the different drivers at the event scale. And the important point here is that the x-axis is stream order. So as we increase in stream order, you see less events, and then you also see longer duration events. And this is really the flood pulse concept from Wolfgang Junk that I think it was put out in like 1989. This is really quantifying that and highlighting that these are general patterns that we are seeing across the USGS gauge network. But in a little bit of time left, I want to talk about some work that my master's student, Matt Shockey, is doing in the Sipsey River. So this is what we call a minor bottom. So it's along a sixth order stream here in just actually like 10 minutes from campus. So it's a really great site to work in. So Matt's actually, he's interested in both what's driving variation in inundation and the surface water groundwater connectivity at the local scale within the floodplain, and then also how that variation is driving tree species distributions. So thinking about inundation dynamics, he built a really simple hand-based inundation model. And I'll get back to what hand is in a second. But looking at flow here on the left, that's kind of what the orange area is, what our normal hydrograph looks like. And then we had a really wet year this year in Alabama, and so that's what the blue hydrograph is. And when he converted that to inundation using his hand-based model, you can see that generally we have inundation in the Sipsey anywhere starting in January through the summer, and then there's not as much inundation, or at least inundation from the river. But this summer we had quite a bit of inundation. You can see the blue line there, and he had to work really hard to get in to do his tree surveys over the summer because we can't get out when it's inundated. And so one of the questions that we're really excited about is looking at there's what we call backwater sloughs, but these side channels that connect to the main channel, and they often there's water moving through these when there's elevated flow, but potentially not overbank flow. And so we wanted to look at water movement between these sloughs and the upland area. And we had a limited number of sites, so we had 5 sites. But something that's really interesting is that these sites, sometimes they acted as a source to the upland environment. Sometimes they were a flow through, and then sometimes they were a sink. And one thing that was, and again, we only had 5 sites, so we need to do a little bit of more work to confirm that this is a real trend. But as you got closer to the river, you shifted from being a source. So the sloughs that were further away from the river were really acting as a source to the floodplain. And then as you move closer to the river, they were a sink. So those areas were draining to the sloughs, and the sloughs were pushing water back out to the main channel. Matt also looked at, he had 50, so he collected, he had 50 experimental plots where he collected all the tree species, and we looked at wetland indicator status. And there's nothing here that's too surprising. We saw that obligate wetland plants, so the darkest blue here, as you got closer to the river, they increased. And I guess this would be a good time to explain hand. Hand is the height above nearest drainage, so it's the height of it's essentially a normalized elevation. So it's normalized to the river. And so hand here, as a lower hand would indicate that you're closer to the river, which is where we would find our obligate wetland plants. And then our facultative upland plants, we saw that they really weren't prevalent across his sites, but we did see, as we got a larger hand, there was a slight increase in those facultative upland tree species. But what's really cool is that we did, or Matt developed a species distribution model, and then based on hand, he's actually predicting different ecosystem functions. So thinking about specific leaf area, seed mass, which is something managers think a lot about, and then for wildlife habitat, and then leaf into P ratio, which is a biogeochemical measure. So one of the really exciting things is that we're taking his data and trying to predict ecosystem function, and we're hoping to take this and make it an actual tool that managers can use to, one, look at where maybe they should be protecting bottomland hardwood forest, but two, think about restoration efforts associated with these areas. And so with the little bit of time I have left, I've kind of started to develop this conceptual model, and I would love to talk about this afterwards. But I talked about this hierarchical model of what's driving hydrologic variation and those cascading functions. But as I think everyone in the room probably thinking, it's not one directional. Each one of these scales, there's interaction across, two-directional interaction across those scales. And then I think I would argue that there's also, thinking about these hierarchical drivers, they have different roles in ecosystem functions. And over the next few years, I really want to think about our management applications. It seems to me that there's a mismatch in scale with our implementation of management plans, and thinking about how we can actually manage our system in a way that we apply the correct tools at the correct scale. And so with that, that's all I've got, and I'm actually right at 45 minutes. So I really appreciate you guys coming and listening to me. And I would love to hear any feedback if you have it afterwards, or if there's time for questions.
All right. Yeah. Well, yeah. Let's go ahead and give a virtual round of applause. Nate, it was a great talk. And do feel free to how we usually run this is inputting questions into the chat that we can get to for the discussion here. Doesn't look like we have any right now, but I guess one question I had to on the study that you were mentioning, you're using planet data to back out methane fluxes. Could you talk more about how you were using that data?
Yeah, and so I definitely want to highlight that was Kelly Hondula's brainchild, and she's an amazing researcher, because she not only does a ton of field work, but she does really cool computational and remote sensing work. But so planet data, and hopefully I'm not. Well, I'll go ahead and describe it, but I probably a lot of folks already know what I'm talking about. It's really high resolution. They use these microsatellites. I think there's like 300 in orbit, and essentially you're able to get high resolution, like sub 3 meter pixels on almost a daily basis. And so what Kelly tried to do was use some random forest classification models to classify areas that were inundated versus not. And really the challenge there is and I'm probably butchering this, so hopefully if you're a remote sensor, please forgive me, but there's a subpixel mixing, seeing through the trees and understanding what's wet under the trees, because these are forested wetlands, is really difficult. And so that was the challenge that she attacked with that. And then once she had these estimates, which there were some part of the seasonality she wasn't able to capture in her remote sensing estimates. But then what she did, once she did have like an initial estimate of those inundated areas over time, she played with using some really simple methane flux models to see, well, if we're going to use wetlands in our Earth system models, both at the regional and global scale, what size wetlands should we include? Should we include the small wetlands, and should we include the variability? Should they be static boundaries where we just think about methane fluxes from those static boundaries, or should we think about the expansion and contraction of those wetlands? And so I think that the thing that I really got out of that work was that these small wetlands are really important players in methane production, and they're also something we really don't account for in our Earth system models.
Cool, got it. Thanks. Yeah, let's see. It looks like Sejong Cho. You can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi, Nate. It's really good to see you, and I'm really excited to see that you're doing research on the drivers and implications of storage and connectivity. And I'm doing actually research on hydrologic and sediment connectivity. And so I wanted to ask you if you have considered, in addition to ecosystem functions, but sediment transport and other geomorphometric and landscape evolution into your conceptual model. If not, let's talk.
So Sejong, I'm so happy to see you. For those of you who don't know, Sejong and we postdoc together at Succinct. And so, yeah, it's really great to see you. We should definitely catch up. The work we're doing here in the Southeast, specifically the work Delaney Peterson, my PhD student, is doing. Yes, absolutely. We've thought a lot about what's driving the channel incision and trying to kind of think about, well, we have this one watershed. How do we take the information, this high resolution information that we have from this one watershed, and scale it up? And I think part of that is developing predictive relationships on, well, where are we going to have channel incision, and then thinking about what that means on a regional scale. And that's, we're just cracking into it, but the channel evolution model doesn't work in these little streams. It's like it's halted almost. And so, yeah, I would love to talk about that more, because I think that's absolutely, it is the driver of these systems, or at least the template for what's the hydrology and all the functions, for sure.
Yeah, I'll be at the Frontiers in Hydrology. If you're going to be there, we should chat, because I am doing research on how we should harmonize hydrologic connectivity with sediment connectivity, as well as nutrient connectivity. I think this is a really interesting way to crack the mysteries of landscape processes by looking in terms of connection and disconnection. So it's really exciting.
Thank you for that. And I'm not going to be at that meeting, unfortunately, but we should set up a time to talk. And that goes for everyone as well, but especially Sejong, because I miss seeing you and all your awesome artwork.
So we have a question from Paige Baker. Do you have challenges with defining wetland boundaries versus streams, and how do you go about that?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. So far we have not tried to define the wetland boundaries, but and Paige, I imagine this is where your question's going, so jump in. But when we start modeling these systems, we do have to maybe actually think about that. So yeah, that's going to be a huge challenge, because it's hard to disconnect the stream from the wetland in these systems, because it really feels like a flowing wetland. But yeah, I would love to get your input on that for sure, because that seems very challenging.
Yeah, I mean, happy to talk when we meet next week, but I was just wondering, if that's something like, especially your conceptual model that you showed with like the separate bioreactors and pipes, it's like, how does that play into being able to define the actual wetlands that you see in the field? So I was just wondering if you've addressed that, or if that's still kind of a challenge you're working on.
Well, so in Delmarva, that has been the challenge, actually. And I think moving towards, right now we have the simple box model, and I think that's the limitation of that model is that we have to make boundaries and chop the landscape up, but maybe using more of a physics-based model where we don't have to make those boundaries, kind of like this, the stuff you're doing might be the way forward, as something we've been talking about a lot as well.
Cool. Yeah, and it looks like we had a comment here from David Kelly. So would it be possible to obtain a bibliography for all the references you mentioned in your talk? And he said we are working on vernal pool wetlands, hydrodynamics in the Central Valley prairies of California. Your work is really relevant to our vernal pool wetland systems. Thanks. So
yeah,
Mhm.
I don't know. I don't know how I would communicate that. Jimmy, is that something I could send to you and Manu, or I mean, also I could share my webpage with the citation. I have, you know, I could share my publication links, and that probably, right. Would that be appropriate?
Yeah. We could do that. And even if you wanted to, yeah, I can kind of save this chat here too and send it over.
Yeah, and so what I'll do right now is I'll just send my publications page, because I think it has most everything I talked about. Yeah. Okay. There's that. Yep.
Cool. Great. Yeah, I guess one other question I had too, I guess kind of shifting gears to like defining wetlands and wetland size. It seems like definitely not my wheelhouse, but it seems like the like really low order wetlands play an outsized role in carbon processing. Is there like a pretty good handle on kind of like the amount of like small wetlands kind of across distribution across landscapes, and like being able to kind of get after that like total efflux?
No, there's not. So there's different groups of people working on that question. And so I should say the National Wetland Inventory, their latest iteration is way better than it was before. But at different local scales, like our group is working on it in Maryland, but you know, and there's folks working on this in the Prairie Pothole in Florida. But at the national scale, that's a pretty big need, and it's a huge challenge. I mean, people have been working on it for decades, so it's not. I don't want to downplay the efforts that have happened, but for these really small, especially forested wetlands, seeing them through the trees is just it's really difficult. And yeah, I think that's definitely one of the next challenges that we should be tackling.
Got it. Thanks. Well, feel free to unmute yourself if anyone else had any questions. And somebody asked too, we are about reporting too. We are like live streaming this too, and it'll be posted on the EPSP Connects webpage, which I can post in here before we close, but we'll make sure to have this recording out.
And I think there is a link on the YouTube also, so if you can visit that also.
Well, Manu, I guess, did you want to take it away?
So really, thank you, Nathan, for giving this wonderful talk. You connected everything very well, from the upstream small wetlands and small riverhead channels to large flow regimes in the lower parts. So it was really nice. So Jimmy, you want to talk about the next talk or something?
Yeah, it sounds like, so a month from now, we're going to be having a talk from Christina Hopkins with the USGS. And then I guess August, I think, is when we have another one too. We might take a little summer break here for this summer field season. But yeah, I think that was it. Thanks everyone for showing up, and let's thank Nathan one more time.
Yeah, thank you, Nathan. So really wonderful.
Thank you again for the opportunity to talk to you guys. And I look forward to the future talks. So have a great day.
Thank you.